Greetings my dear students and welcome to another class of literary theory. We were discussing liberal humanism, and to understand liberal humanism we had to study English as an academic subject and how English developed over the course of years. We were talking last about F.R. Lewis, I suppose. Yes, we were. We already discussed about F.R. Lewis. He was one of the engineers at Cambridge who brought about a change in the teaching of English in 1920s. So, in 1920s there were 3 engineers who brought about a change in the teaching of English at Cambridge, and those engineers were I.A. Richards, William Emerson and F.R. Lewis. F.R. Lewis we are going to talk about today. And as I told you before, engineers is not an architect who built or who erect buildings or a structure, but engineers of language, engineers who had a very strong foundation or who contributed to the development of teaching of English, and that's how they become engineers. Talking about F.R. Lewis, he was the last of the Cambridge pioneers, the first being I.A. Richards, followed by William Emerson. F.R. Lewis was most influential figure in the 20th century British criticism. He was the most influential. He influenced a lot. What did he influence? British criticism, 20th century British criticism. In 1929, a very important year for him in his life, in 1929, he met Q.D. Roth, his wife, and married her. They were known as Q.D. Lewis. We Virushka Virat Kohli and Anushka. Similarly, we talk about Deepika Padukone and Ranveer Singh. That's like Q.D. Lewis. They were known as Q.D. Lewis. And coming to their doctoral thesis, F.R. Lewis had written his doctoral thesis on the relationship between journalism and literature. At the same time, Q.D. Roth had written hers on popular fiction. So you can see it over here. F.R. Lewis on journalism and literature, his doctoral thesis, and Q.D. Roth on popular fiction. Both these were revolutionary topics. Both of these were revolutionary topics, argumentative topics, debatable topics. And in the 1930s, this couple, that is Q.D. Roth and F.R. Lewis, were glamour couples. Okay? Yeah. In 1930s, Q.R. Roth and F.R. Lewis were known as glamour couple, and in the year 1932, this couple founded an important journal. What was that important journal? It was titled Scrutiny. Scrutiny was the name of the journal that they founded, and they produced it together for 21 years. So for 21 long years, the couple, husband and wife, produced the journal, and they released the journal Scrutiny. What does a title mean? Scrutiny. By the way, scrutiny means observe or examine critically. Scrutiny, the word scrutiny means observe or examine critically observe something. As a title implies, the title Scrutiny implies, it extended close reading, it supported close reading, it stood with or it favored close reading. Yes, the close reading which we have seen before. Close verbal analysis. And it extended close reading method, that too beyond poetry to novels and other materials. So first the close reading was applied to only poetry, but after they founded this journal Scrutiny, they extended this close reading beyond poetry to novels and other materials too. As the title implies, I told you as the title implies. What does this word imply mean? imply. Imply means without saying directly. The title implied means it did not say directly, but it suggested or it indicated that the couple were supporting close reading method, close verbal analysis, that focus reading which we have seen when we studied liberal humanism. Okay, so that is it. Let's see what are the faults of F.R. Lewis as a critic. As a critic, his close readings turned out to be lengthy quotations. What are quotations? You quote something, it is in your own words. So his close readings turned out to be lengthy quotations, that is his own ideas and his own words, and it was too lengthy. He did not add his comments on it. Okay, he was quoting, but he did not add a comment of his own. Like, it was difficult for others to understand because he did not add his comments on whatever he was quoting or whatever critical findings that he has made. That was, firstly, his close readings turned out to be lengthy quotations and he did not add his comments on it. Then F.R. Lewis assumed that a competent reader will see what he sees. He wanted a competent reader to understand what he understood or to see what he saw, and that is not possible because each reader applies his subjective ideas or subjective attitudes when he is reading. It does not mean that each and every reader may or may not be competent, need not be competent, every reader need not be competent. But F.R. Lewis wanted a reader to be competent, and he wanted them he wanted a reader to see what he saw. He wanted them to interpret what he had interpreted already, and that was not possible. Then it has been often said about him that he gives the impression that he is analyzing the text when he is actually or really paraphrasing it. He made an impression that he was analyzing text, but he was just paraphrasing a text. What is a paraphrase? The word meaning of paraphrase is to rewrite a passage without changing the meaning of the original text. You rewrite a passage and you don't change the meaning of the original text. For example, you may have to study a poem. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് ഒരു poem വായിക്കുമ്പോൾ പെട്ടെന്ന് വായിക്കുമ്പോൾ അതിൻ്റെ മീനിങ് മനസ്സിലാവില്ല. അപ്പോൾ there will be paraphrase in your guide, നിങ്ങളുടെ ഗൈഡ് ബുക്കിലോ നിങ്ങളുടെ ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ബുക്കിലോ പലപ്പോഴും ടെക്സ്റ്റ് ബുക്കിൽ തന്നെ പാരാഫ്രേസ് ഉണ്ടാവും. സോ when you read that paraphrase, ഒരു പാസേജ് ഉണ്ടാവും, ഒരു പാരഗ്രാഫ് ഉണ്ടാവും which tells you the meaning of the poem and does not change the meaning of the original text. Text ആവാം, poem ആവാം. So it helps you to understand better. Paraphrase helps you to understand better. In simple words, they'll explain the meaning of the text or the poem. That is a paraphrase. So here they are telling us that F.R. Lewis was actually paraphrasing the original text, but he gave the impression that he was analyzing or he was criticizing it. He was making a criticism out of it. So that was another fault of F.R. Lewis. Secondly, he had a moral approach to literature. That is, his approach to literature was moral. It came out of his moral attitudes, and he thought that the purpose was to teach about life and to transmit human values. So he felt that out of criticism, he wanted to teach people about life and to transmit humane values. So that's why it was told that his approach to literature was moral. Then lastly, his critical terms was never properly well defined. His terms, critical terms, were not well defined. There was no proper or there was no clear definition so that others can understand about his critical terms. In 1930s, Rennie Wellick offered an invitation to F.R. Lewis. Who was this Rennie Wellick? He was another critic, and he offered an invitation to F.R. Lewis. And what was that invitation? The invitation was to spell out the literary principles in a more explicit way. So, Rennie Wellick had invited F.R. Lewis to spell out his critical principles in a more explicit way. Explicit means in a more clear manner, so that people can understand what his critical terms were, or what his theories based on critical theories were. Remember, his critical terms were never really well defined, and he wanted, René Wellek wanted those clear definitions. But what happened was that F.R. Lewis did not accept the invitation. He refused the invitation, and as a result, literary studies was more and more isolated. Literary studies got isolated, it got separated. Literary studies claimed independence from language studies, historical considerations and philosophical questions. See, literary studies gained independence from language studies, historical considerations and philosophical questions. These are other academic subjects, and since F.R. Lewis promoted the close reading, close verbal analysis, concentrated only on the text and not the context, this literary studies was isolated, it was independent, it was self-sufficient and had no connections with all these language studies, historical considerations and philosophical questions. It was self-sufficient and stood on its own. And from 1930s to 1960s, these demarcations existed. So, this literary studies was independent from all these academic subjects from 1930s to 1960s. These demarcations, separations existed from 1930s to 1960s, and from 1960s onwards there was a change. From 1960s onwards, there was an attempt to re-establish connections between literary study and the three academic fields from which it had separated itself. And what were those three academic fields? Language studies, historical considerations and philosophical questions. So, the change began from 1960s, and from that time onwards language studies became associated with all these academic subjects. Remember, Professor of History Edward Freeman had argued that literature had to be studied with language studies, that is, literature had to be studied with language studies, otherwise it would not be an academic subject at all. Which means that language, literature are always associated. Along with that, you should include history, language and philosophy. All that is interconnected. You should learn it together. You should learn it in an integrated manner. These are some additional points to what sections which we have already studied, because I am gathering notes from many sources. So, as a development of English subject, there are many aspects that we saw or we came across, but these are certain additional points to what we have already seen. We have seen a hierarchy and we have seen an order of points, and along with that you have to add this. These are supplementary materials. So, in 1970s, it was the hour of literary theory. So, 1970s was the peak or the hour of literary theory, and liberal humanism was a term applied to theory that came before the actual theory. Liberal humanism was theory that came before theory. And there was a divide between the Church of England and other faiths. So, during the development of English, there was a divide, there was a strong divide between the Church of England and other faiths. And this was during the reign of Henry VIII. During the reign of the King Henry VIII, this divide was prominent, this divide was evident. And it was the time when England withdrew from the authority of Roman Catholic Church. At this time, England withdrew from the authority of Roman Catholic Church. There was a divide like this. See, most of the rulers of England propagated Protestant beliefs. So, the rulers of England propagated Protestant beliefs. What do you mean by Protestant? Protestant is a member of Western Christian Church. See, Protestant was a member of Western Christian Church, and they divided from, or they had a division, or they had a difference of opinion from the Roman Catholic Church, which was the Eastern Church. So, at that time when English was developing as a subject, there was a division between the Protestants who stood for the Western Church, Protestants who were members of the Western Church, and Roman Catholics. Roman Catholic Church was Eastern Church. So, the teachers or the ministers were Protestants. The rulers of England propagated Protestant beliefs. Most of the rulers of England propagated this Protestant beliefs, and this was reflected in education as well. Education also reflected Protestant beliefs. Let's see how it is. Protestant is kind of a Puritan. Like a Puritan is a member of Protestant. You know what a Puritan is. If you don't, I'll tell you. Puritan is a person who has strict moral attitudes. They are very strict in certain matters, and they believe that pleasure is bad. You should not enjoy, you should not laugh, you should not have fun. Pleasure is bad. They harbored strict moral principles, and they felt you should not enjoy, you should not celebrate life. That is Puritan. Puritan is just a member of Protestants. Puritan is a member of Protestant group of Christians in England in the 16th and 17th century. So, Protestant is almost related to Puritan, and they did not want to enjoy so much, or they did not they felt that pleasure was bad, and they stood for strong moral attitudes, strict moral attitudes. That is Protestant beliefs. And we saw already that the teachers had to be ordained ministers. During the development of English as a subject, teachers had to be ordained ministers. We have seen this point earlier. Ordained ministers means teachers had to be priests, and they were supposed to stay in those academic institutions. They were supposed to be priests. And along with that, women had no claim to higher education. At this time, women had no claim to higher education. So, when there is a strict moral atmosphere, naturally women will be sidelined. Women will be completely or totally ignored, because they believe that women are not supposed to have fun, or they are not supposed to be educated. So, women had no claim to higher education, and this was a grievance Virginia Woolf had raised in her work, A Room of One's Own. So, in her monumental work, A Room of One's Own, Virginia Woolf mentioned about the lack of education during those times when women were denied education. By the way, who is Virginia Woolf? She is a modern 20th century English writer who employed stream of consciousness as a narrative device. Okay, coming to Protestants, we saw that there was a divide between the Church of England, okay, and other faiths. Protestants, the rulers of England stood for Protestants. Protestants stood for Western Church. They were members of Western Church, and they were against RC Church, and they were a part of Eastern Church. Roman Catholics were part of Eastern Church. Okay. Coming to George Gordon. George Gordon was an early professor of English literature. George Gordon was an early professor of English literature at Oxford. And he said that England is sick. English literature must save it. Since England is sick, English literature was the only one who can save England. This is said by George Gordon, who was a professor of English literature at Oxford. According to him, churches have failed in this mission, and the social remedies were slow at that time. Churches did not save people, and social remedies were not there. So, English literature had the mission of saving the people. English literature had to save England, and the function of English literature, according to him, according to George Gordon, English literature had a function, not just one function, it was triple functions, 3 functions. English literature had triple functions. One was to delight, the other one was to instruct, the other one was, third one was to save souls and to heal the state. So, according to George Gordon, who was a professor of English literature at Oxford, England was sick and only English literature could save England, and the function of English literature was, there was 3 functions, triple functions: to delight, to instruct and to save the souls and to heal the state of England. Alright, the new bold report of the teaching of English in England was in the year 1921. According to this report, English as a subject was neglected. So, in 1921, there was a new bold report on the teaching of English in England in the year 1921, and this report claimed that English as a subject was neglected. It was totally ignored. English as a language of study was established in the 1920s. As a language of study, it was established in the 1920s after the World War I at Cambridge. Remember the Cambridge pioneers, Richards, William Emerson and F.R. Lewis. So, it was established in the 1920s and remember in the 1921 there was a report and started 1920s, and then there was a development of English as an academic subject. I.U. Richards was labelled as a father of new criticism. So, I.U. Richards, father of new criticism, and his monumental works, very important works. One was Principles of Literary Criticism, the other one was Practical Criticism. So, I.U. Richards labelled as the father of new criticism, and two major works were Principles of Literary Criticism and Practical Criticism. So, these were the additional points or supplementary materials that I wanted to add along with the chronology that I gave you on English as an academic subject. Thank you and have a nice day.